thank you to Harvard TEDx for having me here. This is an incredible honor and a great pleasure to be talking to everyone here today. So the title of my speech is, Do Robots Have Free Speech? And you may be wondering, what does a third-year law student know about robots, let alone code or anything like that? Isn't it well known that most law students know nothing about code? And I'd say, okay, maybe that's generally true, certainly in my case as well. But the story of where this sort of came from was that back in December, I had the opportunity to go see a conference in December where Aaron Pettigrew of Gawker gave a short speech, short presentation on the use of new technologies to micro-target messages to individuals in the course of a campaign. And one of these new technologies is bots. And that piqued my interest. And I said, you know what, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to research this. And so this presentation is the result of this research, which is still ongoing, but it's kind of interesting to share with you the results we've seen so far. So I'll admit the title is a little disingenuous, because I'm not really talking about robots like this little guy. I'm also not talking about things like Siri or Amazon's Alexa, although some analysis might be pertinent. What I'm talking about are automated social media accounts, aka this stuff. So like in the top corner, we see sort of your garden variety Twitter bot, which has some algorithm where they're basically posting to different people's Twitter handles this line: did you know that Facebook is disabling accounts of activists? Which is probably not true. And then also below Tay tweets, which if you haven't heard of, it was a Microsoft experiment to create an artificial intelligence teenage girl on Twitter. It didn't end well. It lasted about 24 hours and ended in horrific catastrophe. If you want to know more, just ask me in Q&A about that. So what are the uses of these bots? So generally speaking, as programmers and the platforms become more sophisticated and AI becomes more robust, the uses of bots proliferates and increases. And so I like to sort of lump them into two categories. There's benign uses, and then there's malicious uses. So benign uses can include something like having a bot on Twitter that gives you a weather update, or automatically posts a score from a recent sporting event that a human would otherwise have to do manually. There's Reddit bots that go around and look to see if any links in your posts are broken, and if there is one it finds, it's just going to post under you and say, hey, by the way, buddy, your link is broken. You might want to check that. And those are good uses. There's also some uses of bots to actually engage people when they use things like hate speech or racial slurs. So there's one guy who publishes results in the Journal of Political Behavior where he found that if he had a bot that actually went and sort of admonished people or engaged in constructive feedback when they used a certain racial slur, that person that they targeted was far less likely to use that slur in the future, which is really cool in my opinion. I think that's a good use. However, there's also bad uses, malicious uses. So these can include things as sort of entry-level bad, as like retweeting stuff, boosting how many likes and upvotes or downvotes on certain posts that you see. Generally speaking, making it seem like certain posts or ideas are more popular or less popular than they actually are. There's also the ability for these bots to engage in hate speech or spread disinformation or lies or conspiracy theories. And if you think this is all sort of abstract, it's not. There's real consequences to this. And just to sort of illustrate that, we can look at the recent incident in DC where a gunman showed up at a pizzeria because he had read online that in the basement of this pizzeria was some sort of pedophilia ring run by Hillary Clinton and John Podesta. So he read this online, and the thing was, it started as some sort of hoax or a joke or something in either Reddit or 4chan, got picked up on Twitter. But according to Professor Albright from the University of Milan, he found that it turns out that most of the accounts that were talking about this weren't actually people. It was bots. And so it seemed like there was this groundswell of common knowledge that, oh my gosh, there's this pedophilia ring, when really that wasn't the truth. And it led to very serious consequences. That said, there's not just malicious or benign uses, there's also some sort of in the middle, like commercial uses of bots. So bots can be used to sell things. And if they can sell products, they can also sell people and ideas. And that leads us to the 2016 election. So here we have some research from the University of Oxford which looked at tweets during the presidential campaign. And here is just a general sort of sense of what the tweets are going on during the run-up to the debate. The black is just general neutral hashtags. Red was pro-Trump, blue was pro-Clinton. And they analyzed it with machine learning to detect which accounts were real and which ones were fake or bots. And it turns out that this green line, which is the number of bots making these tweets, was around 20% of all the traffic. Now, that's a fair amount. And the problem is that unassuming news outlets like CNN weren't discerning between this. They would just look at topics that were trending, and they would then re-amplify a message that was already being amplified by the use of these bots. And so you may step back and say, well, okay, Byron, what's the big deal? You know, like, okay, so there's a bunch of bots, like, who cares? They're just throwing around garbage. We can all tell the difference between a bot and a human, right? Right? No. Turns out it's a lot more difficult. So there was one experiment in 2014 where it found that 70% of bots went undetected by Twitter. There was another study from the University of Reading where during an actual Alan Turing test where people were sort of primed to think and look and detect bots, they only got it right 70% of the time and got it wrong 30% of the time. These are people who were like actively looking for it. My hunch is that your average user of the internet is not that discerning, and that's not because they're necessarily stupid, it's just because maybe there's a difference in technological savviness or education levels. And also, just in general, these bots are getting really sophisticated really quickly. In fact, they're kind of like Terminators. They like have a face, they have a name, they have a profile picture, they have fabricated geolocations, and depending on how sophisticated the programmer is who made it, they can really actually engage with you pretty easily on like in a question or a dialogue. So if you're like me and you care about whether or not the internet is still in public domain for public discourse, political discourse, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of truth, where people can actually debate and persuade each other, this should be a little concerning. Certainly, the Trump campaign wasn't the only campaign that did this, the Clinton campaign did it too, but the idea that there's sort of these armies of bots out there sort of polluting our marketplace of ideas, it is alarming. And it leads to a very sort of simple insight, which is that as more and more political discourse moves online, campaigns are going to follow. And so just as an informal poll, I just want people to raise their hands. How many of you in the last like 3 months got into a debate on Facebook or Reddit or some online platform with somebody you didn't know? Only a few of you. Okay. For those who raise your hand, how many of you done that with equal or more frequency in real life? Okay, so they're the same. So maybe you guys aren't necessarily a representative sample, just because maybe you guys are more plugged in, more actively engaged, especially if you're coming to a TED Talk on politics and robots. But my bet would be that most people are having fewer in-person talks and more online talks. And so this makes us ask, well, what should we do about this? And there's sort of 3 things. So first of all, we can talk about it. The very fact that I, someone who was working on a campaign this fall, and I think is relatively plugged into current internet trends, didn't know about this until about like 2 months ago, or certainly a month after the election, shows that bots really went under the radar this year. But the more we talk about it, the more we sort of alert people to their presence and how they function, maybe people will be a little bit more discerning about what they see and what they read on the internet. So that's step 1. Step 2 is there can also be technical solutions. And so platforms on what I call the front end may tighten access to APIs to sort of reduce the number of bots they actually want on their platforms, or try to eliminate them altogether with old technology, old in relative sense, technology like CAPTCHAs. On the back end, if they do want some bots on their platform, like Twitter might still want some good bots, they can use advances in machine learning to try to detect which bots are good, which ones are bad, which ones are violating terms of service, and get rid of the bad ones and delete those accounts. But this leads to sort of another interesting scenario, which is, well, if that's the case, are we just leading ourselves into a sort of cyber arms race where it's going to be the bots versus the anti-bots, you know, and it's just going to go on and on and on? Is there any room where we can maybe get Congress or the law to help us on our side and try to prevent this from, you know, get this under control? And this is a really interesting question, and this is whereas I can't necessarily speak on the technical side of things, I can talk to you about what limitations there might be with the law. And so before I answer this question, let me just first observe that this is really hypothetical because, I mean, certainly the law lags behind technology, generally speaking, but on top of that, we're living in a political climate right now where it's very hard to get anything done. It's very unlikely Congress is going to want to have to take on this issue. They don't really have the political willpower at the time. But if we were, nonetheless, to sort of ask, all right, well, how would you do it if we could do it? What would be the theory? What would be the obstacles? Well, the first obstacle is about 200 years old, and it goes like this. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech in permanent part. That's the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And you may say, look, Byron, you have your answer. If Congress is going to try to regulate the use of these bots, nuh-uh, sorry, First Amendment. That's it. You know, it's like, if the programmer has the right to free speech, doesn't the bot too? Maybe not. It's actually a little bit more complicated. And to answer this, it's worth taking a step back and analyzing the levels of speech that actually occur within the robot or the bot. The first is the code that goes into the bot itself. And then the second is whatever the bot is saying. And so because the second level is a little bit easier to digest, we're going to start with that first. So generally speaking, under the First Amendment, whatever a bot says is usually protected. Or at least it's as protected as anything you or I might say. So just as, for example, if I use fighting words or threaten you, or I engage in speech that is likely to incite imminent violence, those things aren't protected under the First Amendment, just as much as it would be if I said it online through a bot, or I said it to one of you right now in person. But that said, there's another level of speech, because what if we had Congress write a law saying, fine, you can have your bot say whatever you want, just say that the bot, just make sure the bot says it's a bot. It just reveals its true identity. What about that? That also might run into problems. And to do that, we have to look at the code. So the code itself is considered a form of speech, at least under some circuits. So there's one case called Universal Cities versus Corbally. There's another case, United States versus Bernstein, where the Second and Ninth Circuits respectively have held that code is a form of speech. Just because it's indecipherable to most of us, or many of us, doesn't mean that it's not speech cognizable under the First Amendment. However, with the idea that it's speech doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily going to be protected. And we run into something called the compelled speech doctrine, which may sort of throw a wrinkle into this. And to illustrate, we're going to look at Apple's recent kerfuffle, that's how they call it, with the FBI. So last year, the FBI wanted to hack into the iPhone of the San Bernardino shooter. And they went to Apple and they said, Apple, write us some code to let us into the iPhone. And Apple was like, we politely declined. And so FBI was like, all right, we're going to go to the court and make you write this code. And Apple was like, we politely declined. And so a legal debate, a legal incident sort of came before, and Apple wrote in a motion against the order saying, look, this is compelled speech. You're making us speak. And that's offensive to our corporate identity. And you may be thinking now, well, what is this? Was there any merit to this argument? What is this compelled speech doctrine? And the answer to that, it actually goes all the way back to 1943 in a case called West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, where the court ruled in a very landmark case that the government can't compel you to express an opinion or belief that you don't actually believe in. And that's referring to political opinions. It was the case of a kid didn't want to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So FYI, none of you have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance if you don't want to. Fun fact. But the Apple used this argument to say, we find writing this code offensive. So the problem with the Apple FBI debate was that it never got resolved. FBI found a workaround. The court case went away, became moot. So the court never actually answered whether or not anything to the extent that this whether or not this counted as compelled speech. So here's how I analyze it. The way I see it is that code is speech, yes, but code is a set of instructions to a machine. And the bot is separate from the code. In fact, The bot is sort of an emergent property of not just the code that was used to write it, but also the code of the platforms it used to interact with and interfaces with, the wires and the cables and the servers that create and give rise to the internet, and then ultimately you in your browser where you're looking at that bot and reading what it says. So the code and the bot are actually sort of different. And so looking at what the bot is used for and the intent behind it, I think allows us to make a relatively colorable distinction. So I would say that it's probably unconstitutional for Congress to pass a law that says if you make a bot of your own personal use, for you to then insert code into that bot saying it is a bot, and to reveal itself as a bot. Why? Maybe this is your form of free speech, it's your form of hacktivism, it's your form of making art. So your bot, if you want to do that, you don't have to reveal that it's a bot. But if you're selling bots, like the kinds that were sold to the Clinton and the Trump campaigns this last election, that's a different story. Because there, you're not engaging so much in speech as you are in creating a product. You're creating an empty signifier that someone else is going to use and use to proliferate their message. In that respect, government can compel speech. So we might get around this compelled speech doctrine in the same way that the FDA is able to make food manufacturers put warning labels on the food you eat. So, Frosted Flakes, for example, right? They have to say how much sugar is it. And maybe Kellogg thinks that's really offensive, but too bad. They still have to do it. So that might be one answer to how we could solve this riddle of what do we do with bots? Can we have them at least reveal themselves as bots so that when you're going to the internet, you know, oh, this is a bot, this isn't a real person. The other way to conceptualize it is that the bot isn't so much a speech act as it is like a billboard. It's a medium. And the Constitution allows us to regulate media with content-neutral time, manner, and place restrictions. So a law saying that billboards have to be 20 by 30 feet is totally constitutional. Similarly, a law that says a billboard has to have a little sign over here that says this is a billboard is redundant, but still constitutional. And so in theory, we could have this actually work. And there's some precedent for that. There's a court case, Moser v. FCC in the Ninth Circuit, where they upheld Congress's attempt to regulate robocalls. And they said, regardless if a robocall is for a commercial or a political purpose, it's a time, manner, and place restriction, and it's content neutral, so that's okay. So there might be an analogy there. It's plausible, not probable, but it's plausible. But with that, I sort of want to conclude with a sort of an open question and say, okay, even if it's legal to give this, to do this regulation, should we do it? And here are three very well-known justices, Holmes, Brandeis, and Harlan, who each espouse the theory of free speech, when we should regulate it and why, and they all have answers to this. However, what I think is sort of a large insight from bots is that, the technology of the future is really going to stretch the wisdom of the past. And so welcome to the brave new world of bots. Thank you.